So let's take a look at the CorePAD and its progression with a basic crunch exercise. We obviously don't want to start on level 6. I know that's a lot of people's tendency is to start with high numbers and see if they can do them. That's not really great progression. If you do happen to do that, be really, really open to the idea that you might need to move away from that quickly. And you're going to have to figure out what things you're looking for to acknowledge that. But the bottom line is your individual, like Meredith, your client, your patient, needs to have already mastered to some degree this crunch on the flat surface. And on the flat surface, they're basically laying here. And of course, there's skin and tissue here, hopefully, on your client. But they're laying here starting in what is virtually a neutral-ish position. And they're progressing into the shortening, i.e. the flexed position of the spine. So really, for most people, if they have any degree of extension beyond that, they're nowhere near working through their full contractile range, and certainly not working through their full available joint positions. So one of the things you might do is actually look at their extension, maybe in a seated position before you even start. So if I take a look at Meredith's extension, and I'm not just having her lean back, she's actually taking this part forward as if she's taking her rib cage and stomach forward and then leaning back a little bit. So she's somewhat balanced over her hips, but she's got a lot of extension. And you're not here to judge it, you're here to acknowledge it and file it away in your memory. I might be able to progress her up to participating in a crunch with that entire amount of extension she just displayed. But I might not. That'd be a poor assumption, because when she goes from seated to laying back on her back, those are going to be different forces and different requirements. But it's still something that shows me her structure appears to be okay with that, right? So I'm going to love to assume that I can go with more levels here, but I'm going to start based on the rules of progression and avoidance of malpractice. I'm going to start with pretty low level. I typically don't go to number 1 unless I've got someone with a lot of complaints and I'm even curious if I can use it at all. I'm going to start with number 2, and that's why the first 2 levels are wrapped up in that innermost set of vinyl, Velcroed vinyl. So Meredith, go ahead and lay back here, because the big key here is how you're going to position this under the person. And no matter what I show you on Meredith, it's still going to be specific to your individual, because they're not necessarily going to have your client or patient's not going to have motion occurring at exactly the same places or the same length of spine. So when you look at this, this is a pretty neat setup she's got right here, because you can kind of see that it's up near the shoulders, near the top of the T-spine, and barely extends under the sacrum. So the apex is near kind of the center or apex of her extension. As I mentioned before on previous video about the original history of this thing, it's not meant to be just a lumbar filling thing. It really needs to span the entire spine, but that's still going to be individual specific. So take a look from here. It's easier for her to be in this starting position because she's just rested here on the table still. We have not exceeded the extension that would require her to be up off the table with her shoulders yet. And then we're just going to go through the same basic crunch where she doesn't use inertia. She's responsible for learning to tighten and learning to shorten and working on the squeeze. And that's a whole other subject, the progression of a crunch and the teaching of a crunch, and not the throwing of a crunch. So forget your counting and worry more about quality. But what we might do with her, given that she could do quite a few of these and maintain control, and we know she has more extension, we might see if she can progress. So I'm going to have you sit up again, Meredith. And we have a choice. Do we want to go to number 3? Or does she appear to be strong enough and have enough motion from our assessment over here that we might try number 4? Well, for the sake of time on this video, and for knowing what I know about her, this is not my first assessment or investigation of her abilities. I'm going to go ahead and come on up here to what is level 4. You can see the numbers over there. And so go ahead and lay back on here. This is going to start to approximate her end extension, because if you notice, she's still comfortable going back there. Yes, I'm putting words in your mouth, sure. But it's still comfortable for her. But to go up any higher, I'm not sure is going to do anything but any extra, because she does not have that much more extension. She'll just have an inability to keep her head on the table. So more is not always better. We're looking for just right. So Now here's an interesting thing about setup this time. Because as it gets higher, where her bottom versus head and shoulders are on this thing can be a progressive situation. Right now her bottom's on the table. So as she crunches up, she's actually rolling off of the top of the pad. She's rolled past the apex of it. This is actually a little easier. If you understand strength profiles, you'll also know this is fairly consistent with the strength profile for the trunk flexors because they lose contractile ability the shorter they get. This is a great progression as I go higher to have her rolling off of that thing. So it feels a little easier there probably than at the start. Now, everything's about progression and in small amounts. What I might have her do when she's proven over multiple sessions to be able to deal with this and control this, I might have her position herself a little bit further backwards, meaning not towards the table, but up towards her head, slid up on it. So now you can see her bottom's not necessarily touching it, but neither are her shoulders. She's really right now just about centered over the apex. And the way I would recognize that is if she crunched to the top and did not roll off the apex, but rather was ending kind of right there with still some segments on it. That's probably a pretty tough place compared to the other one. If she were to master that, I probably have another slight adjustment, a little bit, not even as much as you did on that one, but a little bit towards the head and shoulders. So let's scoot just a little, maybe, yep. Because you get too far, well, I'll show you what happens when you get too far, but right now go ahead and look at this. And you might even need to put a hand down here to anchor, because the more load there is, the harder these are pulling. If this gets heavier than this, she's not going to be able to lift this. So it's a basic law of support, and i.e. physics, when trying to create these true strengthening or output improving exercises. So that was probably even tougher than the other one, right? Yes. And you could even alter it with different sets. You could do a warm-up down here, you could move to a tougher one, and then after a set of that, you might, as progression, go back to an easier one, working your way up to a couple sets with the tougher end of the deal. Now here's what happens if you go too far. You just end up with, keep going, her thoracic area is just laying on the table. And yes, it's going to be tough for her to get up there, but this thing's not doing what it was before. She's already crunched before she even gets up, in a sense, because of the contour of the table versus the pad. So this, if you go that far, this is where you're constantly investigating. You're constantly looking at the small adjustments. You have to be detail oriented. So anyway, go ahead and sit up if you can. That was a pretty good example of progression to this level. And as I mentioned in the previous video where we talked about the levels, level 3 and level 4 is just about the end of a crunch for most people. And an awful lot of people won't even get this far.